Okay. Welcome. We wanted to talk about some terms we often use in workshops and realize the need to kind of slow it down a little bit. And so, Dylan, I'm curious, when you say white supremacy culture, what does that mean to you?
Jennie, I'm so glad you asked. Just kidding. Okay, so this feels really important to me to like slow it down even more. This feels really important to me because the words like racist and white supremacist or white supremacist like bring up so many feelings for white folks in particular, I've noticed. And so we often, when we're in workshops and just like off the cuff, I mention white supremacy or white supremacy culture or whiteness or racism, it brings up all these feelings, and we don't talk about it. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation ahead of time so that like we don't just move on in a workshop without having that conversation. So to me, white supremacy culture is it's not about like individual white people and our behavior, though it does often show up individually in behavior. I sometimes hear like facilitators trying to take care of the feelings of white folks in the room by being like, it's not about individual white people, it's about a system and about a culture. But I think like the other thing that's important there is it is about all of us as individual white people and about how we are reinforcing this culture. So I first heard about white supremacy culture on this worksheet at a CAR-W workshop up here in Seattle, Coalition of Anti-Racist Whites. And the authors were Tema Okun, who's a white activist, and Kenneth Jones, who's a black activist, and many organizations that they worked with. They compiled data on white people for like, and organizations run by white people for like 40 plus years. So when folks are like, oh, this is just one person's opinion, like speak from your own experience, like it's like data on us white people that was like collected over a long period of time about ways that we act that reinforce racism, and it harms people of color on both interpersonal levels and systemic levels. Like it's the same, like the way that like defensiveness or fear of conflict show up interpersonally is more like, hey, don't mention the way I was racist, or like don't bring up this issue between me and you. But then there are systemic issues around conflict avoidance too, like racial liberation can't exist in politics, for example. Like don't bring up like this is not like a part of politics, right? Yeah, that's like, so yeah, I use that worksheet everywhere I go, and it's starting to sound jargony, so I wanted to talk about it. How about you? Like what does it mean to you? Like what reflections, or like, yeah, do you have any reflections or responses, or what does it mean to you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think when you were talking about how and tell me if this is right, you were kind of talking about how you've experienced facilitators kind of like caretaking white people in the room of like, it's a system, it's not you, like, and you didn't use that tone. So of course I over dramatize this, but
Yeah.
Does that resonate for you?
Yeah, and I'm so curious to hear your thoughts on it, because as you're reflecting that back, I'm like, oh, like I already knew it was messed up, but it's going deeper in my head. So go, yeah.
Yeah, and so like this work is so complex. Anti-racism, unraveling oppression from the inside out for us as white people, it's so complex. So I think it is so important for us as white folks to take action and to be accountable for our actions. And I think when I talk about white supremacy culture with white folks, depending on kind of where they're at in their awareness of their own whiteness, their own racism, I do think it is a doorway in to realize, yes, we are all racist. And I often think about white supremacy culture as a way that we've been duped, into a system and continuing the perpetuation of that like cycle and that wheel that just continues. And we are a part of a system. And I think for white folks, once we hear that and we realize that, then we're like, oh, well, that's not okay, now I can change, versus I think the way I learned about racism growing up in progressive public school education was like, there are the racists who are bad and they're over here, and like we are not those people. And so for me, when I came into, and I can't remember, I'm like, oh, look at you remembering exactly when white supremacy culture like was defined for you. I don't remember the exact moment or who it was and which teacher gave me that gift of knowledge, but I do remember feeling like, oh, then I'm more empowered to want to change as a white person, as an individual within that system. And so I think it can be, understanding systems can be a doorway in for folks, especially when, as we are white people and we're waking up to the harm that we're causing, waking up to the destruction that us being in a room breathing can bring up. To understand the system can help us move forward into changing the way we want to be. So I think it's both. So as I say that, I'm like slowing down going, oh, we're two white people having this conversation. Are we like caretaking, right? And so it's so complex. And I do think that, I do think of it as like being duped. Like we were, not that we have a harder time than people of color. I'm not saying that, but that if we can reframe a little bit and be like, I can't believe I believed that, and I can't believe this has been going on so long, then it gives me more hope to change it.
Thanks for saying all that. I really appreciated the way you brought people of color into the room about like it being like just our existence in a room, right? The white gaze, like just our existence can be harmful because of the systems of oppression we live in the historical and current trauma of racism. And so I'm like, what that brings up for me is like all of the discomfort I've been in looking at. I remember when I looked at this list of like ways white supremacy culture shows up, and I was like both really uncomfortable, and also I felt like this opening of like finally, like people keep saying like white people don't have cultures, so we're stealing from other cultures, but that's not the full story. There's also this like whole list of ways that white people reinforce racism without even knowing it. And sometimes with knowing it, right? But like for those of us with the value of anti-racism, we often don't act on that value because we've been so deeply socialized into this, or duped, as you say. But I forgot where I was going with that. Why people? But I was thinking also about like the discomfort of how of seeing all these problematic ways I've shown up and continue to show up in my whiteness on this list in front of me. And like one way that I continuously reframe that for me is like me learning about my own whiteness and my own racism is, yes, painful, but like totally incomparable to the pain of living with it, like being on the receiving end of it, as people of color every day, right? So whenever I think about that, like, you know, this is uncomfortable or this is painful, you know, this is the most pain I've ever had to experience about race, like that's a huge privilege. I appreciate you like recentering that and recentering people of color.
Yeah, and even even hearing you share that, it reminds me of the ways that we as white folks in this work can, like when you frame it like that, about like no matter what pain we're feeling, it can't even compare and we will never know as white people. And to me, when I hear that, what activates in me is some resiliency of like, okay, this is uncomfortable, and like, come on, like we can do this, like we can do this work. So we will talk more about white supremacy culture, and I appreciate this quick little dive into what does it mean to both of us in this moment. This is not an exhaustive dissertation, so stay tuned for more and stay connected, and we want to also hear like what does it mean to you. So thanks, Dylan.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Bye.